Yo, welcome to Six Layers, the comic interview show, period. I'm Mike the Six Layer, chilling with Mark the Honorable Villain. What up, man?
What's up, Mike? We have one of the greatest comic book creators with us joining us. I still can't believe it. Tell him, Mike.
I can't believe it either. Joining us today, we have comic book legend Klaus Janson joining us. But before we chat with Klaus, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right. We use the word legend too lightly these days in society, but our next guest is an absolute legend. Over 40 years of comic book experience on his championship belt. His name is synonymous with The Dark Knight, Daredevil, worked with all the publishers. He worked with a who's who of comic book Hall of Famers. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Slam, we bring to you epic artist, Klaus Janson. How you doing, Klaus?
I'm doing, I feel much better about my career just listening to the two of you.
Proper introduction.
I appreciate it from both of you, please.
It's an absolute honor to have you on the show, Klaus.
Thanks.
We're going to just dive right on in because we've got quite a few questions for you. Okay, so since it's your first time joining us, Klaus, we like to get your comic book origin story. In other words, how did you get your first gig in pro comics?
I was still in high school when I started going to New York. I lived in Connecticut, and I started going to New York to show my samples and to show my portfolio. And that lasted for about 2 summers. I was working at McDonald's at the time. And finally, somebody, Rich Buckler, was up in the office, and he had a little bit of a desk in the corner of the office. And I was doing, applying Zipatone to some of the black and white stuff that Marvel was reprinting. So I was already in the office, kind of, kissing a lot of ass. And Rich saw my portfolio and he said, would I like to ink Black Panther? And I said I would. And I remember the two of us, we were scurrying around the hallways of Marvel looking for Roy Thomas, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, trying to establish a rate for my inking. And Rich said, hey, Roy, as he was running down the hall, is it okay if this guy inks Black Panther? And we're like, yeah, sure, no, whatever works, whatever you want to do. And $40 a page was my rate.
And this is still in high school, a couple years out of high school?
A couple of years out of high school, I was working at McDonald's and doing a lot of, I would go to the city like 2 or 3 times a week. From Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was 50 miles, so I'd get on the train. The big break, I have to say, the big break, you asked how did I get my first assignment? Mm-hmm. But my big break was meeting Dick Giordano up at DC, and he became like a second dad to me, and he became my mentor. And I was his assistant for a little while. And I don't know if you know this, Mike and Mark, you guys tell me. But Dick had like almost like a mini school where, Terry Austin was his assistant, and Bob Wyacek and Bob Layton, myself, Steve Mitchell, just a whole bunch of people that he mentored. And I was lucky enough to be one of those because we lived right kind of next door to each other, and
oh wow,
he lived in Stratford, I lived in Bridgeport. They were towns that abutted each other, so it was really easy, to get there. Although I would get lost every time I left the house, and he would have to come pick me up. I'd call him from a gas station, and I'd say, "Oh, Mr. G, to tell you that I'm lost."
we're going to.
He would say, I'm sorry, but he would say, okay, describe where you are. It was hilarious.
When I saw you last year at Baltimore Comic-Con, I asked you a Neal Adams Crusty Bunker question. And so for the purposes of the show, I want to re-ask that question. Tell us more about Neal Adams and the Crusty Bunker. What was your role there? But most importantly, what did you learn from the Crusty Bunker?
The Crusty Bunkers was a sort of a improvised group of people, basically meaning anyone that was in the office of continuity. Continuity was a advertising sort of agency that Dick and Neal teamed up to work together. And they did a lot of mostly advertising, McDonald's commercials and storyboarding, stuff like that. And I learned to stay away from Neal Adams. That was one thing. He was a very tough critic, and the Crusty Bunkers' job was to ink whatever Neal and Dick were working on at the time. So I happened to ink Howard Chaykin's Fafford and Gray Mouser, which DC, I think, was publishing at the time. I did some McDonald's French fries drawings, stuff that, like pretty much a monkey could do, So I was, my work was terrible. It was just awful.
Bob McLeod told us a little bit about how it was. Klaus, we interviewed a few disciples of the late, great Dick Giordano. Can you tell us a little more about who he was to you and what was his impact on your career?
So you say he gave you your first break, your first big break.
Dick was my first break in the sense that I learned that people do this, that there are artists, there are writers, there are editors, there are organizations called DC Comics or Marvel Comics. And Dick taught me a lot of tips about inking and penciling, of course. But he also taught me how to be a professional, that it isn't just about the work. You have to meet your deadlines, for example. But, the thing that Dick is, I think, largely responsible, or not responsible, but his biggest characteristic was his generosity of spirit and of understanding and empathy and sympathy. And I remember going to his house and showing him many times. I would show him pages, and he really wouldn't say too much of anything, which I took as a bad sign. These pages were, I was a kid. I was 18, right? So what do I know? And one day I brought him a page, and I remember what page it was too. It was a page of The Creeper, which I loved Ditko's work on The Creeper. I thought it was just phenomenal. And we were eating sandwiches. So this is important because I remember everything. I remember we had sandwiches, we had pickles on the side, and I guess some soda or something. But he held up the page and he said to me, "This is a good page." And he looked at me and he said, "If you can do one good page, you can do another." And I thought, in retrospect, I thought that was like incredibly awesome to me at the time. And I realized in retrospect, that was a genius thing to say. It was the most supportive and well-intentioned message that he could possibly have given me. And what he gave me was permission to enter this life where I would become what I did become, what I became. That was the moment that turned everything around for me. He really gave me, he opened the door, and I realized, okay, I can step in here and become what I want to be. Fantastic. So that was a big deal, I'll tell you.
Man, it sounds like a big deal to us, man. We've mentioned quite a bit about inking, and you're, in my opinion, the foremost inker alive. You're the grand poobah of inking to me. If I have any question about inking, and this is a question about inking, I'm going to ask Klaus Janson right now. What we found out, Klaus, is that inking is specific to comic books and not like the overall traditional art. I wanted you to tell us all, what is the importance of inking in comics, and why is inking a thing in comics?
Yeah, inking, and you're absolutely correct. It is very, very unique to comics, and it doesn't really exist in the way it does in comics outside of comics. But inking really started as a way to produce more comics. So instead of having a penciler or an artist, let's use that broader term, instead of having an artist in the 40s and in the 50s do one book by penciling and inking it, the geniuses in the people at the publishing house said, well, why don't you pencil a book and or 2 books a month, and we'll get somebody to ink it, so then we can double your productivity and double our productivity, the number of comics that we can make, and of course double the profits. So it was an assembly line that was created specifically to be an assembly line. And I think that inking, of course, I think both of you know this, that inking has changed a lot in the last even 20 years,
right?
10 years. But inking became something larger than it is now. Back in the 70s, when I was doing Daredevil with Frank, or Dark Knight, or working on Sal Buscema over Defenders, Marvel and DC both were looking for inkers that had an identity, or inkers that could sell books. And so inking developed into something very compared to what it was, say, in the 50s. I mean, nobody knew who inked Kurt Swan in the 50s or in the 60s, right? It became something in the 70s, really. It became something bigger, and you could actually, that could be your identity, that could be your job, an inker.
Then there's the whole world where it's the compatibility between the penciler and the inker, and the penciler may wanting to prefer certain inks over his or her pencils.
I keep on thinking when, as you're describing it, about the word legitimacy. It wasn't an afterthought. It became a legitimate art form, as you say. I think that, the 70s and the 80s, my experience during that time, and it feels like, so long ago when you say the 70s and 80s, because it was. But the 70s and 80s, Marvel and DC had their agenda was to people together that were compatible, and that would create something larger and bigger and better than the individual artists, the individual penciler or the individual inker. And to, I think, a large degree, I think when you look at the best penciler inker teams, that is what makes them stand out. You could talk about John Byrne and Terry Austin on X-Men. You could say Tom Palmer on Gene Colan or Neal Adams, on X-Men, or on Tomb of Dracula or Doctor Strange. I mean, these people had worked really, really, really well together. Dick Giordano on Neal, doing Batman, that all of those people and their work became iconic. Pairings work out by any means. That's something that I found out through my own experience. It's funny, I'm thinking about Sean Phillips. I love Sean Phillips' work. And we had the opportunity to do a Kingpin miniseries. I forgot what it was called. It was like a one-word title. But Sean penciled it and I inked it. And I loved it. I absolutely loved the way it looked. It looked very different than the stuff that I usually do. It was a little simpler, a little more blocky. You know, I tried to make it look like Sean. Yeah, I don't know why that popped into my head, but just as an example of,
Right.
of I think, how compatibility does play a huge part in the success or failure of a penciler inker team.
Klaus, you touched a little bit earlier on one of your frequent collaborators, Frank Miller. How did he first get paired up with you, and how has that relationship worked for so long, from Daredevil to Dark Knight 3 to other books?
I was doing, and maybe you guys know this, but I was working on Daredevil before Frank came on. I forget how long, but it was
Like
6 issues, 12 maybe. I'm not sure. You know, I might have skipped one because I was doing something else. But I know that I inked a lot of really good people: Carmine Infantino, Gene Colan, Bob Brown. Gil Kane,
Wow.
one of my favorite pencilers of all time. Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing. And as a kid, which is, you know, what I was, it was heady. You know, it was great fun. I really took it seriously. But at one point, my job, by the way, which is I always describe as I was the continuity guy. Or consistency guy. I was the guy that made sure that Matt Murdock's hair was always parted on the right side, on the correct side, or that he had the same, you know, glasses from issue to issue, because sometimes somebody would be on a book and pencil it for one issue, and then we'd hop off, you know, and get. The book wasn't really doing that well, and so nobody really paid it much attention. And then Frank came on. I remember meeting Frank for the first time in the hallway at Marvel. He was already on the assigned to the book, and you know, we introduced ourselves. I know Frank told me this. I didn't know it at the time, that he asked for me to stay on the book.
Oh, wow.
So I guess, you know, if he had said, you know, get Joe Schmo. I wouldn't be talking to you. You'd be talking to Joe Schmo.
You were the Daredevil guy. You had such a long tenure on that book. I also wanted to switch over.
Sure.
Can you tell us about getting started on the Dark Knight Returns? When initially working on that series, did you realize it was going to be the project that had an impact on the world?
No, and Mark, honestly, nobody did. No one. Everybody was caught by surprise. Everyone, and everyone dealt with it in their own way. Yeah, it was a really interesting time. You know that I learned a little while back, I didn't know it at the time, that Dark Knight Returns was the first comic book that had a second printing.
Oh, really?
One.
I think.
Yeah. There was no such thing as a second printing or third printing or fourth printing, whatever, before Dark Knight. So you can imagine that the people at DC who published this book, their hair was on fire. You know, they were so happy. You know, look at this. So it was very, very heady. You know, Frank was like on the cover of Time magazine and Rolling Stone. I'm kidding, but you know, it was very, very, it was very heady.
Were you guys in the same studio? Like, what was the whole process like getting that?
You know, Frank and I for a period of time lived about 4 blocks away from each other in here in New York, and if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the Dark Knight Returns 4 issues, Frank moved to California, I think it was during that time. But I know that he was in New York for at least the beginning of Dark Knight, because he would come to the office and show pages to Jeanette Kahn and Dick Giordano and Denny O'Neil and all the people that were involved. So I think he would do that fairly frequently. So the workflow was he would do the pages and bring them to the office, and I would either pick them up or they'd mail them to me. And the first 20 pages of Dark Knight Returns, the first one, I inked, I think, mostly in brush, and then we took a break because either I was doing something else or Frank was doing something else, I'm not sure. And the next 20 pages, I went back to ink it. It was almost a year later or 9 months later, and I started using more pen or nib. So you can kind of, it's the scene where the guy in the taxi cab that looks like Walter Simonson.
Okay.
That was the I think the last page I inked in the first 20-page run, and then switched to pen, a couple of months later when we picked it up again. Yeah, I forget what Frank was doing or what I was doing, but yeah.
Klaus, what was it like teaching at the School of Visual Arts in New York, and what did you take away from that experience?
Wow, that's what did I take away from that experience? Well, one thing, teaching is a good thing. Learning is even better. But teaching and learning, those are really good things. And I really believe in both of them. I believe in teaching. I believe in giving back. I believe in learning constantly, as much as we can. I found it teaching to be very fulfilling. And I still keep in touch with a number of my students going back 30 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is a long time. I think I started teaching in 92. Boy, was I nervous, man. Yeah. I discovered that, let me say this about teaching. The first week that I taught, the first class that I taught, I pretty much went through everything I knew, 3 hours in 3 hours. And I came back the next week. I was teaching one class a week. I came back the next week and I realized I ain't got nothing. I got nothing to teach. I got nothing. I'm empty. And I realized I don't know anything. And so I went to the ground, so to speak. And I really studied. And I really tried to formulate an approach to storytelling and to penciling and to inking and sequential narrative. And I became a better artist as a result. I don't know if the kids did, but I did, because I really started to understand what this is that I'm doing. And it was eye-opening. So that's, you asked me what I take away from it. I became more knowledgeable and more informed and a better artist. And I'm extremely grateful for that. Yeah.
Klaus, you're saying right now how your course or how your art process has changed over the course of your career. How else has it changed using different mediums, using different brushes, using different pens?
Digital or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty consistent in the tools that I use. The one big change, of course, is digital, and all of my pages now have some digital on it. I was talking to I was at OAX last weekend or the weekend before, I forget.
Right.
But I was
That's
talking to Chris Mooneyham. I don't know if you know his work. I think he's doing G.I. Joe right now,
Okay.
or Transformers, one of the. No, I think it's G.I. Joe. Yeah. And he shared his process with me, and I thought to myself, that's saving a lot of. Excuse me. He's very smart, and I should try that. And long story short, I realized that I can't make that work for me for whatever reason, his approach. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go completely digital. I don't see why I'm doing, half the page on the board and then the other half digital. I think I should just go completely digital. But are you asking me, what's that's changed? I want to get back to coloring. Some of the commissions that I do are going to be color, so I'm enjoying that. And I'm doing an assignment where I'm going to color it, on the board, and then play with it in the digital, in the tablet.
What was that process like? Going from traditional stuff and then picking up what you had, an iPad or a Cintiq or something like that?
It was extremely hard. It was painful. I don't look, Mike. And Mark. I don't know about you guys, but I find that is not the most pleasant feeling. It's just you feel stupid all the time, and at least I do. I feel like, oh my God, you are just your brain's not working today, buddy. But I'll tell you something that you talk about the transition going into digital. The transition going into penciler was either harder.
Really?
Because I had been inking for 5, 6, 10 years before I started to get back to penciling. And Gil Kane was responsible for my inking, being an inker, by the way.
Oh, wow.
But when I started to pencil again, people didn't want to hear it. Once you're pegged as something, it's very difficult to get out of your identity, so to speak, or the identity that people have given you. That was really, really hard. Took me years to shake the reputation of being only an inker. It took years.
I got to ask this question about how you got involved with the DC Comics Guide to penciling and the DC Comics Guide to inking comics.
They asked me. I had established somewhat of a reputation as somebody who was a good teacher and who might know something. I had done a lot of workshops, some at DC, some at Marvel, some for artists, some for editorial, some for writers. So through the years, I think people just got to know me as someone who likes to teach and who might have some capacity to pass that on to someone else, because teaching is not easy. I remember one of the editors at one of the companies came up to me, I think it was Marvel at the time, and said to me, what's really useful about the workshops? And I was, of course, all ears. I said, tell me. And they said that you're giving us the language to communicate to our artists about what we want. So editorial is not mostly they're from a journalistic background or an English background. There's no art training. So, to use a mundane example, if you talk about a two-shot, they may not be versed in that, although, you know, a lot of them are movie fans, so they have some movie knowledge and terminology. But teaching, and I thought that's really a very interesting thing, that it allows you to share language by which we can communicate with each other and agree upon certain terms. You know, I find when I argue with my friends, which is often, but unfortunately, you know, I don't know what that says about me. But I notice that when I argue with my friends, you know, after like 20 minutes, I realize it's all about semantics. We actually kind of agree. It's just about language. You know, you're calling this something and I'm calling the same thing something else. It's just language. Anyways.
You've seen all the highs and lows of the comic book industry, Klaus. What is the biggest lesson that you've learned in your comic book career?
You have to be self-aware.
Oh, okay.
You have to understand what your weaknesses are and what your strengths are. And you have to plan and play accordingly. You have to exploit your strengths. You have to understand your weaknesses, you know, both as a human being and as an artist. And you have to work on your weaknesses and not be afraid of them. I often think that when I'm drawing a page, if I make what is referred to commonly as, you know, in air quotes, a mistake, I will not redo it. I will lean into it. I will lean into it because I think that the mistake, in air quotes, I'm sorry I did that. I think that the mistake is telling you something and you need to learn from it. It's like life. And I think that my theories and philosophies of sequential narrative and storytelling are also a philosophy about life. For instance, you want to be responsible for your behavior in life.
Right.
You also want to be responsible for the decisions you make on a page. There's no one else responsible for it. The editor is not going to save you. He's not responsible for it. The writer is not drawing it. He's not responsible for it. You are responsible for that page, and that success or failure of that page relies completely on you. And if you don't recognize that and you say things like, yeah, I'm not placing any blacks because the colorist will save it. Nah, that ain't gonna work. It's just not gonna work. So you need to be responsible in your life and you need to be responsible in your work. And that's just one, similarity. So in a lot of ways, approaching drawing and being an artist is really having a philosophy of life.
You have a decorated career. Is there a work that you're most proud of?
I will sometimes I will see work that I've done and I think to myself, wow, this is pretty good. I mean, I like the way it looks, right? That's kind of, yeah, there's something about it. And I think to myself, if somebody else did that, and I know this sounds a little arrogant or egotistical, but if somebody else did that, I think to myself, I would buy this. I like it. I just like it. And then there are jobs that I think, I don't care for it that much for whatever reason. But if you're going to ask me, what I'm most proud of, I think the first story that I wrote was Batman Black and White. That I like that one because that sort of broke the no writing
I think
thing
that was
for me.
issue number 3. I think black and white 3. I think.
Yeah, I think I think with the Barry Smith cover.
Yeah, Barry Smith cover. Yep, I got your sig on it. That's why I knew.
Yeah. So sentimentally, that was a good job for me, a pivotal job for me. I did I think Gothic
with Grant
was
Morrison.
a really good job. Yeah, with Grant Morrison. I really liked that job. Mr. Freeze with Sean Murphy. I think it was called Mr. Freeze or whatever. That was a nice job. I really enjoyed that. Inking John Buscema.
Oh, wow.
Inking Frank. I'm very happy with that. Inking John Romita Jr. That was good work. I think sometimes when John and I talk, we agree that the Thor we did was probably the best thing. Although I like the Wolverine we did too, with Mark Millar.
I like those Spider-Man issues.
The Spider-Man, you're right. It was good. It was good stuff. Yeah. What can I thank you, Mark?
Those are my favorite.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Some of those jobs are like some of my favorites. Yeah.
Awesome. Many, many highlights. We have one last question.
Sure, of course.
Is there something that we haven't talked about that you want the fans to know about? Any upcoming work? Any upcoming appearances?
Well, I'm going to make the rounds this summer. My convention schedule is not locked down yet, so I can't announce it. But I'm sure I'll be at least a convention every month, if not more. I think in terms of work, and please come by and say hi. I really hate sitting there having nothing to do. So in terms of work, I am not supposed to say anything, but John Romita Jr. and I are doing a project together.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's been a couple of years since we've worked together. And so this worked out time-wise, and we're probably the first issue will be out, summertime, like everything.
Okay.
And also, I don't know if you know a project called Sacred Creatures, published by Image. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. The first volume was out, back then. And my collaborator, Pablo Ramundi, and I are working on the second volume. And so we're hoping that it's 5 issues, each issue about 40, 45 pages.
Okay.
And then, of course, the trade paperback will be out. And we have worked so hard on this to make it as good as we both can. He's doing all the art for his section. I'm doing all the art for my section. So it kind of, you jump back and forth in different times. It's good. I hope people look for it.
Klaus, thank you for joining us, man. This has been fantastic.
You're welcome.
You always have a home here on the Six Layer Station. So thank you once.
Thanks. Thank you both, Mike, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Six Layers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Klaus Janson. We are out. Peace.
Six Layers.